Thank you for taking the time to view this short presentation about a very important yet largely still unknown part of Canadian history. We hope that it will help you understand the background and significance of the British Home Child Migrant Scheme. As a nation, it is important to know what has made us who we are today. Our short presentation is called Lost and Found: The Story of the British Home Children. British home children, or child migrants, are the terms used to describe the over 100,000 children who were systematically immigrated to Canada from Great Britain to work as indentured farm laborers or domestics. The majority of them arrived between 1869 and the 1940s. In the beginning, the motives behind this child migrant scheme seemed to be well-intended, sending poor British children from the overcrowded and filthy city slums they were in to clean, healthy lives on Canadian farms. A simple plan, yet fraught with inconsistencies. Families were torn apart. There was improper scrutiny of placement families, and once the children were placed, a lack of supervision. By taking a look at that time period, we hope to better understand why so many children were sent away from their homeland and their families, and why it was an acceptable practice. Some indeed did have better lives, while some were forced to live in a much worse nightmare. The Industrial Revolution was the cause of concentrated urban poverty. During this era, there was a tremendous transition from production of goods by hand to large-scale manufacturing in factories. New chemical and iron production processes, increasing use of steam power, and the development of machine tools changed every aspect of daily life. Average income and population began to show sustained growth for the first time. It was a key turning point in history. Many rural families, looking for a chance to better their lives, began to move to the cities. This major shift, combined with the influx of 300,000 Irish immigrants who were trying to escape the potato famine, burst the seams of large cities. The living conditions of the poor in places like London, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Birmingham were appalling. This changed the system of closely knit extended families, who had, up till now, remained in the areas they were born in. Family members moved a large distance away, and this had consequences. Parents could no longer depend upon their family's support in the event of their death or ill health. Children were left with no one to turn to. There were no social systems in place to help out. These dire conditions caused the British Parliament to craft the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834, replacing the Poor Law of 1601. Prior to this act, helping the poor was the responsibility of individual parishes, which varied widely in their size, population, and financial resources. This change grouped parishes into larger unions, and they were governed by a board of guardians. This more centralized system needed to replace the small facilities that had previously been used with the much-hated workhouse. The workhouses were cold and drafty with high prison-like stone walls. The poor were seen as lazy, and so life at the workhouse was made as undesirable as possible in order to prevent people from abusing the relief system. For the impoverished, the workhouse was seen as a last resort, parents choosing to put their children out to work as young as 4 rather than end up there. When children did work, conditions were usually dangerous. Many children were killed, falling into path of coal cars, or being crushed to death under machinery in the cotton mills. Some suffered horrific injuries in match factories or glassworks. For those reasons, some children resorted to the streets, selling matches, shining boots, or stealing. Lord Shaftesbury, who was an elected MP, became a strong supporter of the rights of working children. He revealed in official reports the details of the abuses they suffered, particularly in the coal mines and textile factories. The public outcry, especially among the upper and middle classes, provided the incentive to change the working conditions of children. Led by Shaftesbury, reformers proposed to limit child labor to a 10-hour day, but factory owners resisted. However, in 1833 and 1844, the first general laws against child labor, called the Factory Acts, were passed in Britain. Under their terms, it became illegal for children under 9 to work in textile factories. Children aged between 9 and 13 should work no more than 8 hours a day. The reformers' main disappointment was that only 4 inspectors were employed to monitor this legislation. They feared factory owners would continue to employ the very young. As well as the Factory Act, reformers believed in the education of the working-class children to be a necessity. Ragged schools, the name derived from the ragged conditions of their pupils, were dedicated to the free education of destitute children in 19th century Britain. The schools were developed in working-class districts of industrial cities. Many philanthropists who later became involved in child migrant scheme like Annie McPherson, Thomas Bernardo, and Alan Bilbrough, were first exposed to the poor children's plight through the ragged schools. In the late 1850s, industrial schools were also established for child offenders by philanthropic societies and church groups to divert children from a life of crime. There, they were to learn a trade which would lead to a better future. Around the same time, an evangelical revival was taking place in Britain, which led to the formation of many religious humanitarian groups. Some of them began to focus entirely on providing the necessities of life to poor children and to teach them about God. Rooms or entire buildings were rented to shelter them. Annie McPherson, a Scottish evangelist who started her first home in the East End of London in 1867, said, "After having them washed, we had beds prepared for them, little thinking that we had to teach them to sleep in them. They had to be taught the most common usages of social life, but eventually they learned to play, laugh, work, and sit still like ordinary children." It wasn't long before the philanthropists were overwhelmed by the scope of the situation. The homes were full to overflowing, and even though staff tried to place them in situations, more children were arriving than leaving. Thoughts turned to a group of children who had been successfully sent to Canada in 1833 by the Children's Friends Society and the West Kirk Workhouse. Immigration began to become a clear choice. Maria Susan Rye, who had already helped young women emigrate to Canada, met with Lord Shaftesbury, and she suggested taking orphaned and destitute children to Canada. He supported her idea, and so did the newspaper, The Times, in which she wrote, "Why not take the gutter children of London, Manchester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Liverpool, and immigrate them to Canada? Can anything I introduce them to be worse than that to which they are doomed?" The Board of Guardians of the Poorhouse Unions agreed. Rye started working with them, and in 1869 brought her first group of children to Canada. Annie McPherson soon followed suit, although only a small percentage of her children were from the workhouse or industrial schools. Helped by her sisters, she had, by 1874, brought 2,000 children to Canada. In the early years, the voyages they had to take to get here could take 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the weather. It must have been quite frightening for the children to realize how far away Canada was. to leave behind everything they knew and to be sent to a placement that was sometimes quite isolated and lonely. The initial reaction of the Canadian public to the home children was of great kindness and concern as they learned of the appalling circumstances in which the children had been. Donations of money, food, clothing, and offers to visit the children poured in. Buildings or even land was supplied. Canada's population was rapidly expanding, and workers of all descriptions were in great demand. Farmers, some immigrants themselves, needed cheap labor to clear their land, plant and harvest their crops. Hired men were in short supply and too expensive for a lot of the farmers, when children could be indentured and work for a fraction of the cost. And, up to 1891, immigration to Canada was under the control of the Department of Agriculture, who wholeheartedly endorsed bringing children to Canada as farm workers, as an economical way of supporting Canadian agriculture. However, once in their placements, treatment of the children varied from farm to farm. Some were very well treated and became like members of the family. Some were beaten, given rotten food, and made to sleep in the barn with the animals. Some were seen as workers and not as children. Reports of neglect, lack of supervision, and placement of the children began to filter over to Great Britain, and in 1874, the local government board responsible for workhouses in England ordered an inspection of the organizations taking workhouse child inmates to Canada. Andrew Doyle's report, focusing mainly on Maria Rye, but also mentioning Annie McPherson, was scathing. Street Arabs, or gutted children, for whom no consent for their immigration had been received, were mixed with what Doyle called the well-trained inmates of the workhouses or industrial schools. Accusations of making money from the children's arrangements and of children not receiving any training were also high on his list. He condemned the selection of their placements and the irregular or lack of supervision there. As a result of Doyle's report, the Canadian government countered the accusations by forming the Select Committee on Immigration and Colonization. Their findings satisfied the Canadian authorities that the children were being treated properly. The child migrant scheme continued. The floodgates opened. McPherson and Rye were soon joined by many other philanthropists, as the belief was still strong in Britain that sending impoverished children to Canada was the right thing to do. Receiving homes began to spring up everywhere, as Thomas Bernardo, William Corrier, James Fagan, John Middlemore, and Dr. Stevenson, amongst others, began to send their children from their establishments in the UK. Well-known organizations and church groups like the Salvation Army, the Church of England, and the Catholic Children's Society joined the movement as well, bringing the total of the organizations to around 55. Applicants for the children far exceeded those sent. When a shipment of children reached Canada, they were either placed by the immigration at the port where they arrived, or, more often, were sent by rail to a receiving home. Within a few days of their arrival, applicants for the children came to the home to make their selection of a child, or the children were sent on to their destinations. Wages were negotiated between the agency and the farmers, and contracts of indenture signed. The children's money was usually sent to the organization to be kept on account for them until they were of age, minus expenses. The most notable and notorious of the organization was Dr. Thomas Bernardo's, sending up to 30,000 children to Canada. In spite of Bernardo's open-door policy, accepting any child who required help, he also took to the streets to rescue children and to bring them to his home. There were inevitable problems concerning his right to do so. It was this fact which led the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Manning, who was also sending children to Canada, to accuse Bernardo of abducting Catholic children in order to bring them up in the Protestant faith. There were reports of parents who, when asking for their children back, were told that their children had already been immigrated, sometimes after shipping notices were sent to the children's parents advising them that their children had been immigrated a week before. As the law stood, no institution had the right to remove children against the wishes of their parents. By 1888, Bernardo had taken many children from what he called cruel, immoral parents in order to give them what he called a good upbringing. Cardinal Manning insisted that Bernardo was breaking the law, and the dispute between the two men was finally taken to the House of Lords. The House reached the conclusion that the doctor's actions had been legally wrong, but that he was morally right. They recommended that there should be a change in the law under which reputable charities would have the right to resist applications for the return of children to grossly neglectful, criminal, or immoral parents. This Custody of Children Act, sometimes known as the Bernardo Act, was created to make these actions legal. It also went on to say that if a parent asked for his child back and the government believed a parent had abandoned or deserted the child, the government did not have to produce the child. The law also stated that if the child was returned to the parent may have to pay the costs incurred to the organization for bringing up the child. At that time, it would have been impossible for a poor parent to hire a lawyer to dispute the rescue of a child or pay back the costs of bringing up the child. Public opinion in Canada was also beginning to change. There were strong opponents to the movement, mainly those who believed in eugenics. Charlotte Whitten, who eventually became the mayor of Ottawa and who was also a member of the Immigration Committee of the Social Service Council of Canada in 1918, publicly denounced the immigration of home children by saying, "Our full strength and resources are bent to the task of keeping this country strong, virile, healthy, and moral, and we insist that the blood that enters its veins must be equally pure and free from taint." Eugenic beliefs, or the belief that the poor possessed undesirable genes and were prone to criminal activities or feeble-mindedness, were sweeping North America and Britain at that time. Dr. Charles Kirk Clark, a prominent Canadian psychiatrist, asylum superintendent, educator, and hospital administrator, believed that European nations were trying to get rid of their insane and genetically defective citizens by sending them to Canada. Whitten agreed with Clark that morality and criminality were inheritable. They believed that allowing these types of immigrants into the country could pose a national menace, as they would produce unhealthy and degenerate offspring. The Canadian Manufacturer, in an editorial, said, "A greater outrage has never perpetrated upon a community than that controlled by Dr. Bernardo of London, whose great aim seems to be to gather up the waifs and the offscourings of the slums of that great city, and to dump as many of them upon this country as it can possibly receive." The Toronto News commented that, "We have enough orphan and abandoned children in our own streets to look after." The impudence of a large class of pseudo-philanthropists who make a trade out of shipping outcast children from England to Canada was well exemplified in the remarks of one who had the cheek to contend that more immigration was desirable. The Globe said that waifs and inmates of reformatories, refuges, and lodging houses are not the classes with which to build up a strong nationality. The Toronto Star reported that the children sent to Canada from England are street waifs and workhouse paupers, and the professional philanthropists engaged in the work are largely prompted by mercenary and not charitable motives. At an 1894 Federal Select Standing Committee on Agriculture and Colonization, MP Dr. Peter MacDonald spoke against government subsidies for the immigration of home children. He stated that the organizations were receiving $2 a head, and his concerns were not based on the welfare and safety of the young immigrants, but on their potential ill effect on Canadian society, particularly because of their eventual intermarriage with existing Canadian settler families. He went on to say, "Those children are dumped on Canadian soil who, in my opinion, should not be allowed to come here at all. It is just the same as if garbage were thrown into your backyard and allowed to remain there. We find from the testimony of disinterested parties in this country that a large number of these children have turned out bad and are poisoning our population by intermarrying with them. I think myself this committee should unite in an expression of opinion that no such $2 a head should be paid by this government to bring such a refuse of the old country's civilization and pour it in here among our own people. We have more means to purify our cattle than to purify our population." The government of Ontario deemed it necessary to pass the Act to regulate the immigration of certain classes of children in 1897. It required the sending organizations to be licensed and a dossier of each child's background to be produced and updated. All children who were returned or ran away from their placements, and the reasons for this, were to be entered into their file. This regulation only applied to children involved in the migrant scheme. Although this seemed to benefit the children, the Premier of Ontario, Arthur Hardy, had this to say: "There is a strong public prejudice against the importation of children, owing partly to the work of placing and supervising not having been properly attended to by some of the agencies. This legislation will assure the Canadian public that every precaution is being taken to guard against the moral or physical deterioration of our people." As a result of this, William Courier tried to fight the legislation, citing that his children were of good standards, and when he lost, he refused to send any more children. It was only after his death that Couriers started sending children again. Dr. Stevenson's National Children's Home reduced their numbers to half. Strangely, Alfred Owen of the Bernardo Home saw it as effective in removing difficulties from our path of all who are engaged in legitimate and properly conducted immigration work. There were continued reports of physical and mental abuse of the children, suicide of some, and criminal activities by others. The Government of Canada responded to these claims by hiring an inspector of British immigrant children and receiving homes in 1899. George Smart from Brockville, Ontario, was the only person to ever hold that title. His job was to visit receiving homes in Canada and inspect the children from the Poor Law Boards. He hired Charles Mayer of Winnipeg to help him in the West. It was a difficult job, as children were scattered throughout the country. Smart was a great supporter of the movement, calling it a distinct blessing to the children. He also stated that the poorest home in Canada would be palatial to that from which they have been brought. His reports were usually filled with examples of glowing success. Soon after the beginning of the First World War, no home children were sent to Canada. Almost all of the homeboys already in Canada who were of enlistment age signed up, although most felt it was their duty to fight for their homeland and their adopted country. There is the belief that many joined as it was the only way for them to get back to Great Britain to see any family that might be there. There is evidence that some underage children ran away from their placements and lied about their ages to enlist. The common belief was that the war would only last 3 months. One of the boys, Claude Nunney, received the Victoria Cross, the highest military award for gallantry in face of the enemy. However, because of the shame he felt about his past, Mr. Nunney tried to cover his true identity by claiming he was Irish and had become Canadian by naturalization. In reality, he was born in England and was sent to Canada as part of the child migrant scheme. In Anne of Green Gables, Montgomery seems to have captured the uneasiness which the common Canadian felt when they were confronted with a home child. In the book, Marilla says to her neighbor Rachel, "Matthew suggested getting a homeboy, but I said no flat to that. They may be all right, I'm not saying they're not, but no London street Arabs for me, I said. Give me a native born at least. I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian." In 1919, although no children were sent to Canada due to the lack of shipping vessels, Great Britain passed the Overseas Settlement Scheme to assist soldiers and their families returning after the war. The scheme offered free passage to ex-military and their dependents to countries in the British Empire. In 1922, this scheme was expanded under the Empire Settlement Act, allowing the general public, including teenagers from the age of 14, to receive free passage. Some of the home child organizations helped with the placement of the young teens. In return for the passage, the immigrants were expected to settle and remain in the country. Canada had always been the prime destination for immigrants due to the proximity to the UK. Now, Australia and New Zealand became more reachable. The Canadian government continued to see child immigration as the cheapest way to increase the number of new immigrants. Yet, they also did relatively little to improve the children's living and working conditions after their arrival. In the mid-1920s, more than 60 British boards of guardians sent identical resolutions to the Canadian High Commissioner demanding that the Canadian government make it compulsory that government officials examine and pre-approve all homes receiving children and frequently monitor those homes. In 1924, the Canadian government passed an order in council that made it illegal for unaccompanied children under the age of 14 to enter the country. This took effect in 1926 and became permanent in 1928. Although small numbers of underage immigrants continued to arrive in the 1930s, these policies largely brought an end to the importation of young child laborers. The practice continued in a reduced way, though, until almost mid-century for those over the age of 14. The Depression era of the 1930s also was a major impetus in reducing child immigration as the children were resented by many men who were unemployed. The child migrant scheme in Canada came to an end as the last group of Bernardo children was sent in 1939, and a final group of children was sent to the Fairbridge Farm School in 1948. Child migration continued, though, in Australia until the 1970s. All in all, Britain viewed Canada as a prime destination for pauper children. At first, child migration was viewed as beneficial to those children. It has been reported, though, that only 1/3 of the children were well treated and well received. The majority were exploited, neglected, defrauded, or mistreated. They were valued only for their labor. Even for those children who were placed in good and loving homes, the general prejudice against the home children did little to make them feel welcome or part of Canadian society. Most never saw their families again and spent many years searching for parents or siblings. Once they were finished their indenture, the children usually remained silent about their past, hoping to be accepted. Many made up lies in order to hide their true identities. This has made it very hard for their descendants to understand what happened to their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents. However, with all the different technology available, more and more descendants are finding out about their ancestors' pasts. Families, separated for 80 or 90 years, have been reunited. Our group, the British Home Child Group International, has various ways of helping you in your research. Social media, like our Families of British Home Children Facebook page, has researchers available to help you track down your relatives. You can check our website for information at britishhomechild.com. You can also enter your British Home Child's information on our database on rootschat.com, and now, most recently, our British Home Child DNA database on Family Tree DNA. We have already had a number of successes and hope that there will be many more family reunions in the future. Thank you once again for taking the time to view our presentation. We hope that you have learned about the British Home Children and that you will pass their story on to your friends and family.